Hey everyone, I'm Caleb, this is In Context, and this time on How to Study the Bible, we're talking history between the Old and New Testaments. The Jewish Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament, closes in the Western Asian Iron Age in the 5th century BC, in the Iranian Plateau's Achaemenid Empire, sometimes known as the Medo-Persian Empire, as those were its leading Iranian tribes, a setting recounted in the Book of Esther. At this time, God's people had been scattered across the known world. The 10 northern tribes were diluted throughout the Neo-Assyrian Empire, starting over 200 years prior. And the 2 southern tribes were diluted across the Babylonian Empire, starting about 100 years prior. Cyrus the Great's alliance of Median and Persian Iranians had taken over the Babylonians during the events of the Book of Daniel, however, and a small remnant ember of the former nation of Israel had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild, led by Nehemiah. The Old Testament story in Esther ends 2 generations later. Let's look across the world for more context. As we step through the 5 or so centuries encompassing our 2 bookends, Xerxes I and Caesar Augustus, I'll be using a year calendar for just this intertestamental period, rather than BC or BCE, so we can count forward rather than backward. Year 0 of this calendar is 500 BC. It's about 2,500 years ago. The star we call Polaris is not yet the North Star. The vernal equinox sunrise isn't set against today's familiar fish constellation, but rather a ram. Geologically, we're still well within the Holocene period, the late Holocene even. But climatically, the modern subatlantic era is just beginning, with generally cooler and wetter conditions compared to the preceding 3 millennia subboreal. In modern-day southern Mexico, the Olmec culture, famous for its colossal head carvings and appearing to pioneer the ritual bloodletting and ball game typical of many later Mesoamerican cultures, is near the middle of its millennium of prominence. Nearby, Mayan cities already boast monumental architecture. The various Chinese kingdom states are still decades away from entering the Warring States period. The fledgling Roman Republic isn't even 1 decade old, having just ended their previous kingdom form. Late period ancient Egypt is in its 27th dynasty, also known as the First Satrapy. For in these days, Egypt is essentially a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Our beginning intertestamental bookend, Xerxes I of Persia, comes to the throne in what is our year 14. In addition to being the basic setting within which the Esther narrative takes place, his 21-year reign also features a failed invasion of Greece, including the famous 300 Battle of Thermopylae in year 20, against a Greek alliance led by Sparta and commanded by King Leonidas. Xerxes is assassinated in year 35 by his own bodyguard commander. By this time, the Warring States period is underway in China, pitting 7 major states against each other for dominance and survival. 3 decades later, during the reign of Xerxes I's grandson, Darius II, a rebellion in Egypt expels the Persian presence from the Egyptian capital and reestablishes native Egyptian rule. This is around the time the Olmec culture starts to fade from the record. The Persians return after another 60 years in our year 157 to reimpose Achaemenid control, but by that point, both Persia and Egypt have a bigger concern on their horizons. Someone is coming for both of their kingdoms, and many more besides. By year 157, a young prince named Alexander is 13 years old. Culturally Greek, Alexander's family rules a separate kingdom to Greece's north called Macedon. At the age of 20, he becomes king of Macedon, following his father Philip's assassination. Just 2 years later, in our 166, Alexander begins his first military campaign, an invasion of Achaemenid Persia. 4 years later, Xerxes I's great-great-great-grandson Darius III lies dead, and the Achaemenid dynasty is no more. Alexander the Great and his Macedonian successors will rule for almost 300 years to come. By the time Alexander dies in our year 177, aged only 32, he conquers an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt to the Indian Ocean and the Himalayas. But in the Macedonian army, all of those considered general officers have fluid seniority and ad hoc commands based on Alexander's day-to-day orders. And without a clear most senior commander or heir, chaos swiftly follows Alexander's death. The Greek word for successor is diadochos, or diadochi in plural. As Alexander's generals struggle against each other for a piece of his legacy, a series of campaigns known collectively as the Wars of the Diadochi play out for over 40 years, ending in our year 219 with the death of the last remaining successor, Seleucus of Babylonia. This brings us into the third of our 5 intertestamental centuries. It is sometime during this century that the Mayan culture begins to use its iconic hieroglyphic writing system. By our year 219, the Diadochus who inherited Egypt, Ptolemy, has only been dead for a couple years. Ruling in his place is his son Ptolemy II, who sometime during his 37-year rule as the second pharaoh of the 32nd, longest, and final dynasty of Egypt, commissioned a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, known as the Septuagint, for his new Library of Alexandria. Ptolemy II's death in our year 254 stands virtually at the midpoint of the Intertestamental Period. By this time, the Roman Republic is 18 years into its series of conflicts with the Phoenician successor empire of Carthage. These so-called Punic Wars will last for another century yet, and will also include a parallel war with what remains of Alexander's Macedon. By our year 279, ancient China has finally exited its 2.5-century-long warring states period, with the Qin state emerging as the victor of the new Chinese empire. The Qin dynasty is short but important. Its first emperor is famous for being entombed with a life-size terracotta army upon his death in 290, and would establish the model for imperial China for nearly 2,000 years to come. Following the Qin dynasty is the dual-period Han Dynasty Golden Age, the first period of which lasts until after the birth of Christ. Near the beginning of our 4th intertestamental century, in 308, the Roman Republic goes to war against the Seleucid Empire, now ruled by Antiochus III. The war concludes in Rome's favor by 312, and 13 years later, the Seleucid throne passes to Antiochus IV, who takes the name Epiphanes, meaning the deity manifest. Antiochus Epiphanes at first has military success against Ptolemaic Egypt, but is then rebuffed by a Roman envoy in the famous Line in the Sand encounter in our year 330. His reign is also famous for the Maccabean revolt a few years after this, events recounted in the Maccabees books of the Apocrypha, and the origin story for Hanukkah. At this same time in Macedon, resistance against Roman domination reaches an end of sorts, as the once mighty kingdom is divided into 4 republics, all client governments of Rome. All remaining resistance in Macedon is over within 20 years, followed by the end of the Punic Wars with the utter destruction of Carthage. Almost 50 years pass in relative quiet. Then, at the dawn of the 5th and final intertestamental century, in our year 400, Julius Caesar is born. The final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra, is born 31 years later, followed by the birth of our other intertestamental bookend, Gaius Octavius, another 6 years after that. In that same year, Rome's other greatest military commander, General Pompey, finally ends what remains of the Seleucid Empire. In our year 440, when Julius Caesar is 40 years old, a significant milestone is reached on Rome's decline from republic to autocracy. By this time, Caesar, along with only 2 other political leaders, Pompey and Crassus, have consolidated so much power and influence between them that by joining forces they effectively ruled Rome and its provinces. This arrangement is known as the First Triumvirate. Over the next decade, Caesar campaigns in Gaul and even invades Britain twice. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Cleopatra's father dies, initiating her joint rule with her brother. In our year 451, Caesar effectively ends the triumvirate and triggers a cascade of events toward autocracy by crossing his army over the Rubicon River into Italy and on to Rome, beginning Caesar's civil war, opposed by his old co-triumvir, Pompey. In the midst of this war, Caesar stops in Alexandria to stabilize conflict between the now rival forces of Cleopatra and her brother. This stabilization ultimately amounts to affirming Cleopatra as the sole ruler of Egypt and adopting Ptolemaic Egypt as a client of Rome. Caesar wins his civil war by our year 455, king and emperor in all but formal title. Unwilling to see their republic ruled by any one man, a group of desperate senators conspires, and Julius Caesar is assassinated the next year. This, of course, triggers another civil war. A new pro-Caesar second triumvirate is formed, including Octavian, Caesar's posthumously adopted son and heir, and Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most accomplished and trusted generals. This new oligarchy opposes the assassination conspirators and wins. At the war's end, Octavian has returned to Rome, with Mark Antony still in the field with the army. Conflict between the two has been building for years, each striving for preeminence in the new post-Caesar world. Octavian has the Senate declare Antony a traitor. Antony joins forces with Cleopatra in Egypt, but Octavian commands too much loyalty in too many legions. And at the Battle of Actium in our year 469, Octavian's forces defeat Antony's and Cleopatra's, and the civil wars come to an end. In 473, Octavian is declared Augustus by the Roman Senate, and is today recorded as the first Roman emperor. This initiates the period of Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And early in the reign of Octavian Caesar Augustus, a census is declared which sends a young couple to Bethlehem. From Xerxes to Augustus, from the Warring States period and the Olmec, to the midst of the Han Golden Age long after the Maya, Leonidas, Alexander the Great, Qin Shi Huang, Antiochus Epiphanes, Julius Caesar, Cleopatra. The intertestamental period was a time of great change. As Scripture moved from the patriarchal covenant to the Messianic covenant, the world transitioned from the ancient to the classical. The common era began with the Anno Domini, and the world would never be the same.